Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something really fascinating. It's this intersection of history and, well, magic.
hmm
Our sources have pointed towards something quite remarkable, how spiritual practices often became this powerful, sometimes hidden force in anti-colonial resistance.
That's right. Often deeply underestimated.
And we're going to zoom in particularly on Celtic traditions, Irish and Scottish, mainly because they offer such a vivid picture of this.
A very potent example.
So our mission really is to help you unpack these kinds of hidden histories. They really challenge the standard stories we get told, don't they?
They absolutely do, and offer some powerful lessons, I think.
Okay, so let's start broad. The sources show this isn't just a Celtic thing, it's global. Magic is a tool against empire.
Mm.
When we talk about magic here, what are we really getting at? What's the core power?
Well, what's really key to understand is that colonialism wasn't just, physical domination. It was aimed squarely at indigenous knowledge systems, trying to erase them.
Right, undermine their whole way of seeing the world.
Exactly. So magic practices often functioned as what we might call counter-epistemologies. Basically, alternative ways of knowing, of understanding truth that directly push back against colonial thinking.
Okay.
They became these vital repositories for cultural sovereignty. And we see this playing out in, about 5 key ways across the globe.
5 ways. Okay, let's break that down.
First, there's epistemic resistance. Colonizers deliberately labeled indigenous spiritual systems, witchcraft, superstition, all that.
To make them seem backward, invalid.
Precisely, to justify their own supposed superiority. But practices like, say, Haitian Vodou or Andean Mesa rituals, that's the ceremonial altar work, they actually preserved forbidden knowledge. Herbalism, divination, cosmology, stuff that directly challenged colonial rationality.
So keeping knowledge alive against the odds. What's next?
Second, you get ritual as covert resistance. See, colonial powers often banned political meetings, obvious threat,
Makes sense.
but gatherings for religious purposes. Sometimes they were tolerated, maybe watched suspiciously, but allowed. So anti-colonial movements got clever.
Ah, using that space.
Exactly. Using ritual spaces to plan, to share info, even bind rebels together with sacred oaths. The Bois Caïman Vodou ceremony, that's the classic example that kicked off the Haitian Revolution.
Right, I've heard of that one. Incredible.
Or think about Kinjekitile Ngwale in Tanzania during the Maji Rebellion. He distributed Maji sacred water, promising it would make warriors immune to German bullets.
Wow. The psychological power of that alone.
Immense. It united different groups under this powerful ritual-based banner. So it wasn't just belief, it was strategic organization too.
Okay, so preserving knowledge, organizing secretly. What else?
Third, cultural identity preservation. Colonizers actively tried to cut people off from their ancestors, their land, even banning traditional burial practices sometimes.
Yeah, breaking those essential connections.
Right. Magic helped revitalize those connections. Ancestor veneration, sacred site protection. It was like saying, we were here before you, we're still connected, we persist. Defending places like Maori Taniwa sites, these are spots inhabited by powerful guardian spirits that became both a spiritual duty and a direct anti-colonial act. The land itself held the memory, the identity.
The land is resistance. Okay. Number 4.
Fourth is subverting colonial power structures. This is fascinating. Think of syncretic faiths like Cuban Santeria or Brazilian Candomblé.
Where African deities were sort of hidden behind Catholic saints.
Exactly, masked right in plain sight. It preserved African traditions using the colonizer's own religious framework as a kind of shield. And then you have prophetic movements.
Like prophets foretelling the end of colonial rule.
Yes, or even predicting its arrival, like Mugawa Kibiru in Kenya, or the ghost dance among the Plains Indians in North America, which promised the settlers would just disappear. These movements mobilized whole communities through a divine authority that was completely outside colonial control. Untouchable, in a way.
Which must have terrified the authorities.
Oh, absolutely. And that links to the 5th point, psychological liberation. Colonialism wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological, designed to make people feel utterly powerless.
Or sick in their spirit.
Right. Magic gave people tools, ways to feel like they could influence unseen forces, regain some sense of control, some agency. Shamans, curanderos, sangomas, they weren't just healing bodies, they were treating the soul sickness of oppression, using ritual to mend the community fabric torn apart by violence.
It's really striking, isn't it, that colonial powers, who publicly dismissed all this as primitive nonsense, they were clearly scared of it. Why? What was it about magic that really, rattled them?
It was the uncontrollability, plain and simple.
Yeah.
You can shoot a rebel, you can imprison a leader, but how do you fight a curse? How do you disprove a prophecy that everyone believes? How do you stop the ancestors from intervening?
You can't use military logic against it.
Exactly. It operated completely outside their framework, their systems of control. It made people, in their eyes, fundamentally ungovernable. And maybe the biggest thing, it allowed for rapid mass mobilization.
Through these charismatic figures, the prophets and priests.
Yes, they could unify diverse, sometimes fractured groups and ignite resistance far quicker, far more deeply than any purely political ideology could. It was a network, a power source. They just couldn't penetrate or control.
Now, when we talk about this demonization of magic, the sources really stress a critical link: the oppression of women. How does that connection work? It feels central.
Oh, it's absolutely profound. You can't really separate the two. The way magic was demonized under colonialism was deeply, deeply gendered. It was intrinsically linked to suppressing women's power, their knowledge, their autonomy.
Oh, so?
Colonizers deliberately, strategically labeled female healers, priestesses, community elders as witches. Why? Often to dismantle the matrilineal systems that existed in many indigenous societies.
Systems where women held significant power or property.
Precisely. European-style witch hunts, that whole model, was basically exported globally. And who did it target? Women who were the keepers of herbal medicine, midwifery, oral history, ritual leadership. Crucially, women who often controlled land or inheritance.
So it was about breaking down social structures that didn't fit the colonial patriarchal model.
Exactly. Destroying societies that had powerful female figures or were centered around goddesses. Think of the Ashanti in West Africa, the Tantric Shakta traditions in India, the Taino Kasikas female chiefs in the Caribbean. It was a direct assault on female authority and non-patriarchal ways of life.
But women didn't just roll over and accept this labeling, did they? How did magic become a tool for female resistance specifically?
No, absolutely not. They fought back, often using those very spiritual practices as potent forms of covert resistance.
Like how?
Well, take enslaved women in the Americas. Acting as curanderas or root workers, they used their deep herbal knowledge not just for healing the community, but sometimes to induce abortions, resisting bearing children into slavery, or even, in some accounts, poisoning enslavers.
Wow. That's incredibly brave, using knowledge as a weapon.
Definitely. And in ritual leadership, you had figures like Cecile Fadiman, the Mambo, the Vodou priestess, who co-led that pivotal Bua Kaiman ceremony. Or think about the Igbo Women's War in Nigeria in 1929. Thousands of women using ritual chants, dances, wearing specific leaves they believed held magical power to physically attack British tax offices, framing their protest as an ancestral judgment.
So women leading the charge, spiritually and politically.
Yes, and prophetic figures too, like Kempavita in the Congo, late 17th century. She blended Christian and indigenous beliefs, declared herself a reincarnation of St. Anthony, and rallied people against the Portuguese slave trade. A really powerful, dangerous figure to the colonists.
It's complex, though, isn't it? You mentioned this double bind.
Yes, that's important. Even within some anti-colonial movements, women's spiritual roles were sometimes dismissed, seen as backward, perhaps, not modern political action.
Sidelined even by their own side.
Sometimes, yes. And tragically, many post-colonial states just kept the old colonial laws criminalizing witchcraft. And these laws, unfortunately, are still sometimes used today, often against elderly women or women who own land, as a pretext to seize their property or silence them.
That's a really disturbing legacy, and we see echoes, like you said, in figures like Tituba at Salem.
Exactly. Tituba, an enslaved woman, likely of mixed Caribbean, indigenous, and African heritage, her spiritual practices, drawing from multiple traditions, terrified the Puritan authorities. Her story really exposes that deep colonial fear of non-white female knowledge and power.
And it's heartbreaking that modern witch hunts in places like Papua New Guinea or parts of Africa and India still often target women, especially older women, often over land disputes.
It's a direct, tragic continuation of that colonial pattern, a weaponization of witchcraft accusations for patriarchal control and dispossession.
So these stories, these struggles, they aren't just ideas floating around. They're literally grounded in specific places, aren't they? If magic was this unseen force, where can we actually see its mark on the land? Where do history and spirit kind of collide?
That's a great way to think about it. Yes, there are incredibly powerful sites all over the world where this convergence happens. Places where trauma has been sort of transformed into resilience, landmarks that show how the sacred landscape itself became a map of
A
resistance.
kind of anti-colonial map.
Precisely. And they really highlight women's leadership in spiritual resistance, too. Let's look at a few. In the Americas, obviously, Bois-Caiman in Haiti, the site of that 1791 Vodou ceremony, foundational.
Right.
Then you have Wounded Knee in South Dakota, the 1890 massacre site, the tragic endpoint for many in the Ghost Dance movement who believed their rituals would restore their world, and maybe Lake Guatavita in Colombia, a sacred Muisca site looted by the Spanish chasing the El Dorado myth. It really embodies that clash between indigenous sacred value and colonial extraction.
Okay. What about Africa?
In Africa, the Maji Maji Sacred Springs in Tanzania, where Kinjekitile gave out the magic water during that rebellion against the Germans. There's the statue of Mbuya Nehanda in Harare, Zimbabwe. She was a spirit medium executed by the British. Her famous last words, "My bones shall rise again," became a rallying cry for future liberation fighters.
Wow.
And the Osun Osogbo Sacred Grove in Nigeria. It's a UNESCO site dedicated to the Yoruba goddess Oshun, but it also served as a practical refuge for anti-colonial organizers. Spirit and strategy, hand in hand.
Incredible. And moving east, Asia and the Pacific, similar stories.
Absolutely. In India, Jallianwala Bagh, the site of the horrific 1919 massacre. Nearby Sikh gurdwaras became crucial hubs for the independence movement, using spiritual hymns, curtains, sometimes as coded protest. In the Philippines, Mount Banahaw, a sacred mountain where female shamans, the Babalan, led revolts against Spanish rule for centuries.
Female shamans leading revolts.
Yes. And Uluru in Australia, a profoundly sacred site for the Anangu people, tied to their creation stories, the Dreaming. It was desecrated by mining and tourism, but recent moves to ban climbing, led by the Anangu, are powerful acts of reclaiming spiritual sovereignty. The land is spirit, they say.
Even in Europe itself, there are sites that connect to this colonial memory, right?
Yes, interestingly, the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Cornwall, UK, it has artifacts that help you see the parallels between European witch hunts and the colonial persecution of indigenous healers. They even have a display focusing on Tituba. And in Nantes, France, a major former slave port, the memorial to the abolition of slavery is inscribed with names of African deities like Voodoo's Erzli, acknowledging the spiritual world the enslaved carried with them.
This isn't just about marking the past. You mentioned modern sites of reclamation, too.
Crucial point. This is ongoing. Think of Standing Rock in North Dakota, 2016-17. The Lakota Sioux and allies using prayer and ceremony as the core of their resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline. It became this global symbol.
It really did.
Or Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, one of the infamous slave forts. Now, descendants of the enslaved participate in door of no return ceremonies, symbolically walking back through the door, reclaiming passage, healing trauma. And in Guadeloupe, there's a striking statue of La Mulâtre Solitude, honoring a pregnant woman warrior who fought the French, using, tradition says, both herbal knowledge and African spiritual protection. These places prove magic wasn't escapism. It was, and still is, a practical blueprint for liberation.
It's one thing, though, to sort of uncover these hidden histories in archives or oral traditions, but it takes powerful voices, doesn't it, to bring them back to life, to make them resonate today. How have artists and writers done that, re-enchanting history, as you said?
Beautifully put. Yes, countless creators have taken on this vital work, resurrecting silenced narratives, turning them into acts of cultural reclamation. They challenge colonial myths by centering suppressed knowledge, particularly female spiritual power, the sacred feminine, you might say. They treat ancestral practices not as relics, but as living archives. And they insist that magic is a valid way of knowing, an epistemology, not just superstition.
So who are some key figures we should know, maybe starting with writers?
Okay, literary pioneers. Aimé Césaire from Martinique. His work, like Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, it just fuses surrealism with Afro-Caribbean spirituality. Anti-colonial revolt becomes almost a magical act of rebirth in his poetry.
Yeah.
Alejo Carpentier from Cuba, famous for Lo Real Maravilloso, The Marvelous Real. His novel The Kingdom of This World puts Haitian Vodou right at the center of resistance. Bessie Head, born in South Africa, living in Botswana, explored colonial trauma through Swana cosmology, often casting her female characters as modern priestesses navigating dispossession.
Powerful female figures again.
Absolutely. Gloria Anzaldúa, the Chicana writer. Borderlands' La Frontera is seminal. She reclaims figures like the curandera, the healer, and the Nawal, the shapeshifter, as symbols of feminist border-crossing power. And Leslie Marmon Silko from Laguna Pueblo. Her novel Ceremony weaves Pueblo creation stories and healing rituals right into the narrative, showing indigenous spirituality as the way to heal the wounds of war and colonialism.
So literature as a form of healing and resistance itself. What about visual arts performance?
Huge area. Wangechi Mutu, originally from Kenya, now US-based. Her collages are stunning, blending Afrofuturism, Gikuyu mythology, feminism, anti-colonial critique. Just incredible work.
I think I've seen some of that online.
Yeah.
Very striking.
It is. Sandra Brewster, Canadian artist with Guyanese roots, creates these haunting, ethereal portraits, often evoking Caribbean spiritual guardians like Obeah women. Faustina Brewster from Grenada does performance art, embodying Caribbean forest spirits to talk about land rights and colonial theft. And John Quick-to-See-Smith, a Salish Kootenai artist from the U.S., uses vibrant colors and symbols in her paintings to map Native history and resistance.
Okay, and theater, poetry.
Definitely. Derek Walcott, the Nobel laureate from St. Lucia. His epic poem, Omeros, reimagines Homeric myths in the Caribbean and features this crucial character, Kilman, who is an Obeah practitioner, a healer who holds deep ancestral knowledge.
Yes.
Layli Long Soldier, an Oglala Lakota poet. Her work is incredibly powerful. She uses Lakota language and ritual structures within her English poems to dissect U.S. government betrayals. She explicitly calls her poetry spell work. And Earl Lovelace from Trinidad. His novel The Dragon Can't Dance portrays carnival not just as a party, but as a profound ritual of rebellion, with figures like the Blue Devil embodying spirits of liberation.
It sounds like academics have played a big role, too, providing the framework for understanding this.
Absolutely essential. Scholars like Sylvia Winter from Jamaica, whose theories explore how colonizers demonized Afro-Indigenous spirituality to impose a single, narrow, Western human identity. People like Stuart Young and Maureen Warner Lewis, who painstakingly went through colonial archives to show how Caribbean Obeah was actually a form of intellectual and political resistance. And Vijay Prashad, whose book The Darker Nations highlights how folk healers were often central to anti-colonial movements across the global South.
And finally, music, film. Any examples jump out?
Oh, loads. Leela Downs, the Mexican-American singer. She often blends mixed-tech cosmology and stories of Carindras into her music, reclaiming that power. John Akomfora, the British filmmaker with Ghanaian roots. His films often explore the African diaspora, linking music, memory, and technology to ancestral knowledge and anti-colonial thought. Think of The Last Angel of History. And maybe Lauryn Hill. The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is infused with references to Ethiopianism, Rastafari spirituality, using that framework to critique systemic racism and oppression. As the great Jamaican poet Louise Bennett Coverley put it, colonization, they pon the one, but Obeah never dead. Magic indoors.
That's a fantastic sweep across the globe. Now, delving into the sources for this deep dive, something really jumped out at me personally almost, the depth of Gaelic history here. Irish and Scottish traditions seem incredibly rich for this topic. What makes them so central, do you think?
That's a really sharp observation, and you're absolutely spot on. Gaelic Ireland and Scotland are, well, fertile ground doesn't even begin to cover it. Colonial powers, especially England, made a very systematic effort to target Gaelic spiritual practices, labeling them witchcraft, pagan superstition. Why? Precisely to break down Gaelic society, to dismantle indigenous sovereignty.
So a direct attack on their worldview.
Exactly. But the flip side is that these very traditions then became incredibly powerful, often very subtle, tools of defiance. Secret weapons, almost.
Okay, so what are the key themes we see playing out there?
Well, one major theme is the vilification of the Dryer, the Druids, the ancient learned class, and the Bean Fisa, the wise woman, the female seer or healer. English laws, particularly the penal laws in Ireland, explicitly banned Gaelic conjurers, sorcerers, charmers.
Right, to stamp out the knowledge holders.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Framing Druidic knowledge, bardic traditions, female healing as demonic or just backward. But vital practices, herbalism, what they call Louibi, divination techniques, seasonal rituals, they didn't disappear. They just went underground. Persisting became an act of resistance in itself.
Right, keeping the flame alive.
Exactly. Then there's the sacred landscape. This is huge in the Gaelic context. Places like fairy forts, ancient earthworks called Rathana or holy wells, Tobar Beanaith. These weren't just scenery, they were spiritually charged places, often linked to pre-Christian deities or powerful ancestors, including the AOC, the fairy folk.
A good people.
Right. People secretly maintained these sites, left offerings, performed rituals like rounds or turas, pilgrimages, often in defiance of landlords or authorities who wanted to fence them off, plow them under, sever that deep Gaelic connection to the land.
And did they actively use these beliefs against the colonizers?
Oh, definitely. Sabotaging a landlord's property, breaking fences, harming livestock might be blamed on the fairies acting out. Oh, the AOC are angry you disturbed their fort. It provided perfect cover, plausible deniability for rebels.
Ah, that's clever. Using superstition as camouflage. What else?
The power of words. Bardic poetry is magical warfare. The Gaelic bards, the Fugi, were incredibly important figures. They weren't just poets, they were historians, genealogists, advisors, and, well, magical practitioners in a sense. They could compose Awar or Glamdison, potent satires or curses.
Curses, like actual magical curses.
Well, they were believed to have real power. Publicly shaming or satirizing a colonial official or a collaborating chief could ruin their reputation, cause them distress, even it was believed physical harm like blisters or illness. It was psychological and spiritual warfare waged through verse. Iagan Rua Usriaphain, an 18th century poet, famously wrote scathing verses against English soldiers and landlords.
Linguistic resistance.
Okay.
Any other key themes?
Yes, this fundamental clash between the Gaelic concept of tuath the tribe, the people, the land, all interwoven, and the English system of colonial enclosure and plantation. For the Gaels, land wasn't just property. It was a living entity, imbued with ancestral spirits, governed by ancient Brehon laws. English colonization sought to break that, impose individual ownership, grids, fences.
Severing that spiritual bond with the territory.
Exactly. So even small ritual acts could become symbolic resistance. Like taking sods, the Gahail Fud, secretly going onto a landlord's field and ritually taking a piece of turf. It was a magical assertion of the old claim, a symbolic reclaiming of stolen land.
Wow. So these abstract ideas are tied to real places, real history.
Absolutely. Think of the Hill of Tara in Ireland, the ancient seat of the High Kings. In 1843, Daniel O'Connell held one of his massive monster meetings there, demanding repeal of the Act of Union. He deliberately chose Tara for its immense symbolic power, linking his modern political movement to ancient Irish sovereignty.
Connecting past and present resistance.
Precisely. Or Tobernault Holywell in County Sligo. During the penal laws, when Catholic Mass was outlawed, people secretly gathered there for worship. They left offerings, rags tied to trees, seeking protection, maybe specifically from the English soldiers hunting priests. Survival through hidden ritual.
And in Scotland?
In Scotland, you have Alexander Carmichael's incredible 19th century collection, the Carmina Gadelica. He spent decades gathering prayers, hymns, charms, invocations from the Hebrides, often from elderly women, preserving this vast body of Gaelic spiritual practice that was actively being suppressed. It's a treasure trove of resistance. Or think of the Glencoe massacre site. Oral tradition holds that survivors invoked Tasharan avenging spirits or spectral fetches against the Campbells and the Crown forces responsible, using spiritual means to seek justice.
Even marriage traditions.
Yes. Things like the Telltown marriages in Ireland, an ancient assembly with roots in pagan harvest festivals where trial marriages were contracted. Banned by the church and state, continuing or remembering these traditions became a subtle defiance of external control over kinship and community life. And of course, writers have championed this. W.B. Yeats, deeply influenced by Irish folklore and mysticism. Fiona MacLeod, the pen name for William Sharp, writing romanticized Celtic revival tales. The great Gaelic poets like Alistair MacMaster Alistair in Scotland, writing fiercely anti-union verse. And scholars like Mair McNeill who documented Irish folk traditions.
It's really striking how these practices, these beliefs, seem to persist. Are there modern echoes, living traditions carrying this forward?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just history. You still see protests, for example, invoking the fairy faith. There was a famous case in County Clare against a road, and more recently near the Fairy Glen in Cork, where activists explicitly used the argument that construction would disturb the AOC, tapping into that deep cultural nerve, sometimes successfully.
Really? Using fairy forts to stop bulldozers?
Yeah. It happens. And there's a growing Gaelic polytheist revival movement. People actively reconstructing and practicing pre-Christian Gaelic religion, making offerings to deities like the Morgan, a complex goddess strongly linked to sovereignty battle prophecy. That's a conscious reclaiming of suppressed spirituality.
And the language itself.
Hugely important. For many involved in Irish or Scottish Gaelic language revitalization, learning and speaking the language is framed, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, as breaking England's curse, undoing the colonial damage, reclaiming cultural identity through the very words they tried to silence. Contemporary poets like Nuala Needham writing powerful, incantatory poetry in Irish, it's all part of it.
So the fear wasn't just paranoia. those laws against charms.
They weren't just about superstition. They reflected a real fear of magic's power to organize, to inspire, to legitimize resistance. A prophecy could start a rebellion. A shared ritual could bind a community. The Gaelic world really shows us. When your culture itself is under attack, the supernatural becomes a vital language of liberation.
This connects so perfectly with that idea of stealth resistance we touched on earlier. How did Gaelic traditions really kind of perfect this art of fighting back covertly?
Yes, Gaelic magical resistance is really a master class in stealth. It's about using cultural practices, beliefs, symbols as a kind of sophisticated camouflage, allowing people to organize, communicate, even strike back, all while evading the colonizer's gaze, often because the colonizers simply didn't understand or dismissed what they were seeing.
So how did it work? What were the mechanisms?
Well, we mentioned fairy blame. That's a key one. Something goes wrong for the landlord, crops fail, a wall collapses, cattle get sick, blame the fairies. Oh, you must have offended the good people. It provided instant, culturally plausible deniability for acts of sabotage. The authorities might scoff, but couldn't easily prove otherwise.
Genius. What else?
We talked about glamdisen, those bardic satires or curses. Delivered publicly or spread through song, they acted as psychological warfare, humiliating officials, eroding their authority, maybe even making them genuinely fearful. Then holy well rituals, going on a turas, a pilgrimage around a holy well, ostensibly for healing or prayers. Perfect cover for a secret meeting, passing messages, networking under the guise of piety.
Hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And pisiog. These are charms or spells, often involving specific objects, maybe knotted threads, strangely arranged stones, hidden eggs left on a landlord's property, intended to cause bad luck, illness, economic loss, a form of low-level, deniable magical sabotage, and troscad, the tradition of fasting against injustice.
The fasting. How's that stealth?
Well, an aggrieved person might literally go and sit on the doorstep of the person who wronged them, say an unjust landlord, and publicly fast, sometimes to the death. It invoked immense social and moral pressure, calling down perceived divine judgment. A very powerful, nonviolent, but deeply spiritual form of protest rooted in ancient custom.
It's fascinating how they weaponized the colonizers' own blind spots. You're saying magic worked as stealth because the English didn't take it seriously.
That's a huge part of it. Plausible deniability was key. Because the authorities dismissed Gaelic spirituality as primitive, irrational, they were often blind to its strategic use. A burned barn must be accidental, or maybe those superstitious locals blaming goblins, puka. They missed the resistance network operating right under their noses.
They underestimated it.
Completely. And then there's cultural encryption. Symbols, a certain knot, the sight of a hair, a sprig of whitethorn, a red thread tied in a specific way. These carried meanings totally opaque to outsiders, but instantly understood by Gaels. Secret signs, warnings, markers of identity.
A hidden language.
Precisely. Which fostered incredible collective secrecy. As the folklorist Elis Ní Duivne pointed out, every cottage could be an intelligence cell. Children learned from infancy what not to say to strangers, how to perform a ritual seemingly innocently while conveying a hidden meaning. It was deeply embedded, and ironically, spiritual leverage. Despite publicly mocking it, many colonizers or landlords privately feared the supernatural. There are accounts of them secretly hiring fairy doctors or cunning folk, often the very keepers of the tradition, to lift curses or find lost items. So they were inadvertently funding the resistance they were trying to stamp out.
That is brilliant. Are there specific historical examples of this in action?
Oh, absolutely. During the night of the Big Wind in 1839, a hurricane devastated Ireland. But in many Gaelic-speaking areas, the destruction of landlords' big houses and estates was widely interpreted and talked about as the work of Ankelísh, the divine hag of winter, punishing the oppressors. Sabotage roads and fences often went unrepaired for ages, blamed on fairy mischief.
Using a natural disaster for resistance narrative.
Exactly. During the Land War in the 1880s, a period of intense agrarian protests, tenants fighting eviction, would sometimes pin fairy thorn sprigs of hawthorn, sacred to the fairies, onto the eviction notices nailed to their doors. A clear warning. Disturb this dwelling, interfere with us, and you risk supernatural retribution. Reportedly, some bailiffs were genuinely stared off.
Wow. Belief as a deterrent.
And in Scotland, during the Jacobite uprisings in the 18th century, supporting the exiled Stuart kings, women played key roles in communication, weaving coded messages into tartan patterns, the so-called tartan telegrams, or singing traditional walking songs while fulling cloth, embedding predictions of British defeat or calls to arms within seemingly innocent folk songs.
That's incredible subterfuge. And you're saying this isn't just quaint history. These tactics, this spirit, echoes today.
It really does. That framing of language revival as breaking England's spell, that's using the language of magic for modern cultural resistance. Those environmental protests invoking fairy fords, that's tapping directly into the sacred landscape tradition. And artists like the singer Iarla Ó Lionheard performing Sean Nós, the old unaccompanied singing style he revives 18th century rebel songs, often disguised as laments or love songs, keeping that spirit of hidden defiance alive through music.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it?
It really is. The colonizers dismissed Gaelic magic as irrational, backward, but they completely missed its strategic genius. By exploiting the colonizers' arrogance, their contempt for indigenous belief, Gaels turned invisibility into armor and their spirituality into a potent, hidden weapon.
That feels like the perfect lead-in to talking about Sorley MacLean. His work seems to just embody this entire spirit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does his life and poetry encapsulate all this?
Absolutely. Sorley MacLean's son Harold MacGillian is, for many, the towering figure of 20th century Gaelic literature, and he truly embodies the spirit of magical resistance. He wielded the Gaelic language itself as both a weapon against erasure and a spell invoking ancestral presence. He channeled that deep defiance, those stealth tactics, into his art.
Just by writing in Gaelic was an act of resistance.
A profoundly radical act, yes, especially in the mid-20th century when Gaelic was under immense pressure. He wrote almost exclusively in Scottish Gaelic, famously calling it the truth in the glen. He saw the language itself as sovereign territory.
So how did he function as a kind of modern bardic resistor?
In several ways. He practiced language as sovereignty, as I said, refusing English, asserting Gaelic's vitality. He used ancestral invocation. Look at his most famous poem, Haleg. It describes a township on his native island of Rossai, emptied by the Highland clearances. But in the poem, The Dead Return, the trees become the vanished people. He literally repopulates the landscape with ancestors, making them living witnesses against the clearance. It's like necromancy through poetry.
Wow, resurrecting the community.
Exactly. He practiced cosmological defiance. He brilliantly fused his socialist, Marxist political commitments with Gaelic Dúchas, that deep inherited connection to land, community, ancestry. In his poem cycle, the Cuilim, the mountains of Skye aren't just scenery. They become witnesses, geological memory, almost swords forged from history and landscape, challenging oppression. He used curse as justice, reviving the old bardic function of Ayar or satire. His poem, The Cry of the Black Wolf, is this furious denunciation of fascism, linking Franco and Spain to the landlords who cleared the highlands. It has that ancient righteous anger. And he rooted everything in sacred geography. His poems are anchored in specific places: Razé, Skye, sites of clearance, sites of beauty, sites of struggle. The land itself speaks through his work.
So he was consciously using those stealth tactics we discussed, but through poetry.
I believe so, yes. He employed coded symbolism. While his political commitments were clear, his use of intense nature imagery, drawing on deep Gaelic symbolism, often allowed his critiques of power to resonate on multiple levels, perhaps evading direct censorship or misunderstanding from a purely English perspective. He utilized the oral tradition as a covert network. His poems were meant to be heard, recited. They circulated within the Gaelic community in homes, at gatherings, strengthening collective identity outside official channels. He invoked ancestors as co-conspirators, those spectral figures in Haleg, the historical memory embedded in the mountains. They're like an unseen army backing up his words. And he articulated a kind of spiritual socialism, framing the struggle for social justice through the lens of Gaelic Cairdia's kinship, community obligation, inherent connection against capitalist alienation and colonial exploitation.
What specific oppressions did his work confront head-on?
He consistently wrote against the Highland clearances, condemning the landlords, the system that forced people off their ancestral land. He wrote powerfully against fascism in the 1930s, seeing the Spanish Civil War as part of the same struggle against tyranny that the Highlanders faced. And he fought against cultural amnesia, the forgetting or internalizing of colonization, urging Gaels to remember their history, their language, their worth.
So what's his lasting legacy? How does his work still resonate?
Oh, hugely. His influence is palpable in the ongoing land-back movements in Scotland and elsewhere.
Yeah.
The efforts to reclaim land and place names. You see it in contemporary Gaelic poets like Angus MacNicol or Mary Anna Nick Domhnaill, who continue to write in Gaelic, wrestling with history and identity. You hear it in music, with many musicians setting his powerful verses to traditional tunes, turning his poems into communal experiences, almost like spell work being renewed.
Communal spellwork, I like that.
MacLean's poetry, you could say, was the incantation that helped keep a language, a worldview, a civilization alive against immense pressure. He proved, through his life and work, that sometimes the most potent resistance is etched in the language they tried to bury.
That was truly a deep dive. We've gone from global patterns of magic as resistance right down to the specific, subtle tactics of Gaelic tradition and the power of a single poet's voice. It's really clear these aren't just footnotes in history books, are they?
Not at all. They're living traditions, breathing acts of defiance, strategies of survival and liberation that continue to echo and be reinvented today.
From Haiti to how the pattern is there. This use of the spiritual, the magical in its broadest sense, as a language of liberation.
Which maybe raises a final thought, a question for you, the listener. If magic, understood this way as suppressed knowledge, as ritual action, as connection to land and ancestors, as psychological liberation, if that really is a kind of blueprint for liberation, where else might you be seeing its subtle, powerful influence playing out? In ongoing struggles for justice, for sovereignty, for cultural survival, right around you, maybe in places you hadn't thought to look.
Something to definitely ponder. Keep those questions coming. Keep exploring those hidden depths. We'll be right here to help unpack them. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.